another question I got from old Dino. And we were talking about horses and how they learn and when they learn and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he was asking me about when I go to roping off of these younger horses. And Jason Hanchy, who's one of the world's best rope horse trainers, asked me the same question a long time ago. And I said, shoot, I don't know, Jason. I guess when something needs rope and it doesn't scare me to death, the idea of jerking my rope down, trying to rope off of a colt, that's the day I start roping on them. I don't really have a plan. And Dean and I talked about it quite a little bit. And what we came down to is that because a horse is a fragmented thinker, which means any new situation they come up to, they have to go through the whole Rolodex of their memory to try to find something to associate with this new experience and decide whether it's good or bad. So in theory, and I've done this, you can jerk your rope down on that first ride when that colt doesn't know anything. It's all brand new to him. You can jerk your rope down on him and go to swinging it, throwing it off of his back, doing whatever, and he won't be scared of it. And if you keep doing that, he'll keep not being scared of it. If you do it the first 10 rides and then don't jerk your rope down again until he's coming 4-year-old and he's actually big enough to rope something off of, he's going to be just as scared of it as if it had never happened, because it's so far back in his memory that fragmented thinker can't get to that memory fast enough. He just goes ahead and gets scared beforehand. So what we try to do instead is have that horse so confident in himself and in us, me as a rider, that whatever's in that fragmented thinking, he always defaults to saddle's on my back, the bit's in my mouth, my rider's here, and he always takes care of me. So whatever's going to happen is fine. We're good, because it's always been good before. There's this theory floating around of exposure. And I'm not saying don't load your horse in the trailer and take it places and this and that. Exposure is great, but exposure isn't everything, because you cannot expose a horse to enough stuff often enough that nothing will scare it. You see this in these colt starting competitions and a lot of these deals of exposure, and they get to a point where they're hyper exposure to where the horse just shuts his brain off because there's so much going on that he just goes, man, I'm just going to take it. They're either going to eat me or they aren't. And that hyper exposure has a tendency for that horse to spontaneously become unbroke. There's actually a cooler word for it, but I can't think of what it is. So that hyperexposure is a bad deal. Yeah, take your horse. Take your colt to the branding, even though you're not going to ride him, and tie him to the fence. Take your young barrel horse to the barrel racing, even though he's 2 years away from actually going to the barrel race. Take him, tie him to the trailer. That kind of exposure is great, but you can't expect it to be everything. What needs to be everything is that the horse has so much confidence in you and in himself that when something new comes up, he can handle it. So back to what Dean and I were talking about, he was saying when he was a kid and he was on these ranches and he was a wagon cowboy, and I'll digress just a second here to explain what the hell a wagon cowboy is. Some of these ranches in the West are huge. They're so huge that during the spring and the fall when they work their cattle, they hire wagon cowboys. We call them wagon trash. They're always young guys. Well, they're almost always young guys. They're almost always really inexperienced guys. And back in the old days, and I say the old days like when I was a kid, for a long, long time, there was a literal wagon. There was an actual wagon, and the cook had all your bedrolls and your teepees and all the food in it, and you just followed that wagon. The wagon would go where the cattle were, and you would gather this set of cattle and work them and camp out overnight or 2-3 nights or whatever, and then you'd go over to this part of the ranch and this part of the ranch and this part of it. And there was obviously more plan to it than what I just threw out there. Anymore, hardly anybody has a real wagon going out Usually it's trucks and trailers and cowboys are sleeping in bedrolls, but we still call it the wagon. That's just a tradition thing. I don't know. That's why we call it that. And I think it's so we're all allowed to not take a bath for a month. I don't know why we call it the wagon still. We still do. But those wagon cowboys are just guys that get hired for 6 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever, and they come help you do the work and then they get laid off. Like I said, it's always young guys and it's always inexperienced guys. And so wagon horses suck because they have spent their whole life being ridden by young, inexperienced guys that are trying to show off to each other, trying to show off to the boss, trying to learn. And so they're the ones, wagon boys are the ones that are going to get in a wreck. Dean was talking about when he was a wagon cowboy, a lot of those horses were so ruined that you couldn't you couldn't rope off of them. You could only gather cattle and hold cattle with them. You couldn't rope off of them because they'd buck you off. And of course, these are, 9, 10, 12, 14-year-old horses, and they were big, tough, snorty, old, shitty bastards that only got rode those 6 weeks in the fall and 6 weeks in the spring by a bunch of honk-yawking kids. And I said, yeah, that's why you couldn't rope off them, because of that fragmented memory. They were ruined. All they knew was wrecks. All they knew was kids riding them, getting them in wrecks. And so they were trying to protect themselves. So it wouldn't have made any difference if someone had had a timeline and set them up to get them to where they were nice to rope on. It would have been ruined anyway through their experience of being wagon horses. So these are some of the things. Almost nobody that's watching these videos is going to have an experience on a wagon or be around wagon horses, and hopefully never be around wagon cowboys. But you all run into spoiled horses. Everybody's going to run into a spoiled horse at some point. That's what you need to think of, is that this horse has spent his entire career, his entire life, having not fun things happen to him. And he's trying to protect himself. And that's why it takes so long to make a spoiled horse better.